Maybe she goes, maybe she don't go.
Hello, listeners. My name is Ellie Hoffman, and I am a student at the University of Washington. This podcast will be broken up into 3 sections: the story of Sally Hemings and her time at Monticello, an analysis of the Sally Hemings exhibit at Monticello today, and an analysis of her descendants' stories, as well as the role of power, coercion, and violence. Part 1. A Brief Story of Sally Hemings. Through Madison Hemings' account in his book, Life Among the Lowly, we hear the story of his mother, Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson at Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia. Hemings shared a father with Martha Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's late wife. John Wales was the enslaver of Elizabeth Hemings, and together they had Sally Hemings. Thomas Jefferson first became involved with Sally Hemings when he asked her to accompany his daughter Maria to Paris when Hemings was only 13 or 14 years old. In Paris, Hemings was legally a free woman. She learned needlework and French-speaking skills. Hemings became the concubine to Jefferson in France. After 2.5 years, Hemings was hesitant to return to Virginia, where she would once again become enslaved by Jefferson. Sally Hemings negotiated for the freedom of her future children if she were to return to Virginia. She relied on the promise of Jefferson and returned to Virginia in 1789. On her return to Monticello, Hemings gave birth to 6 children, 4 of which lived into adulthood. All of them shared Jefferson as a father. They too were enslaved by Jefferson until the age of 21. The second son of Sally Hemings, Madison, wrote that Jefferson was not in the habit of showing partiality or fatherly affection to us children. We were the only children of his by a slave woman. The color of their skin did not determine their status of enslavement at Monticello, but instead the fact that their mother was enslaved. Sally Hemings' children were put to work, taking on roles such as carpentry and weaving. They were not separated from their mother Sally. Sally Hemings took on roles such as sewing, caring for Jefferson's chamber, and looking after her children. While Sally was never officially freed, she went to live in Charlottesville in 1826 after Jefferson's death. According to the Sally Hemings exhibit at Monticello, Jefferson owned 607 people over the course of his lifetime. He freed only 7 and let 3 others leave Monticello. They were all members of the extended Hemings family. 4 were his children. Hemings and Jefferson's children grew up to have families of their own. 2 of them lived life identifying as white people. Sally Hemings died in Charlottesville in 1835. Many of her descendants are identified today. Part 2. Analysis of the Sally Hemings exhibit at Monticello today. The Sally Hemings exhibit in Monticello uses elements of shadow work and animation. Debuting in 2018, it was built within one of the servants' rooms where Sally Hemings was believed to have lived, within Monticello. The viewer enters a dark room where a single figure of women's clothing stands in the center. Words and images explaining Sally Hemings' story are projected onto the wall. Because no known images or definitive descriptions of Hemings exist, the figures within the projections are only shadows. The exhibit uses elements of sound to enhance the humanity of the shadows. For instance, sounds of waves crashing accompany the story of Hemings sailing to Paris, and violin music accompanies the story of her children. Indistinct chatter and mysterious synth brings life to the Hemings story. All of these elements come together to convey the story of Sally Hemings in a humanizing way. It is so easy to forget the humanity and daily lives of enslaved people, many of whom lived and loved like any one of us would do today. Part 3. Analysis of Coercion, Erasure, and Family Legacy. How is sexual coercion a part of white supremacy? In an interview with PBS, Monticello, public historian of slavery and African American life, Nia Bates, makes a powerful statement about the question of sexual violence between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings.
There's no way that we could talk about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson and not talk about the power dynamic between the two of them. He did own her.
Right.
And it would not be acceptable for us to tell this story and not address that power imbalance.
Sally Hemings had a choice to stay in Paris and be free, or go back to Monticello where she had family, but would once again become enslaved. Many other enslaved people during her time did not have the choice. However, because of the age difference and power imbalance, Hemings must have been immensely brave to trust the promise that Jefferson would release her children from slavery at the age of 21. The American feminist and scholar Evelynn Hammonds discusses the role of race within sexual coercion. She writes about the belief in the unbridled sexuality of Black people, and specifically Black women, and how racial difference was linked to sexual difference in order to maintain white male supremacy during the period of slavery. Stereotypes that Black women were more sexually available than white women played a role in how white slave owners treated enslaved women. Unbalanced relationships, like that between Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, reinforced the systemic oppression of Black people, especially Black women. Enforcing racial stereotypes and white supremacy does not only take a toll on the victims of oppression. Martinician scholar Aimé Césaire writes in his work Discourse on Colonialism that colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to degrade him, to awaken him to buried instincts, to covetousness, violence, race hatred, and moral relativism. By dehumanizing others, Thomas Jefferson dehumanized himself. Jefferson created an environment where he and other white people were superior to Black people. By reinforcing the divide between enslavers and people who are enslaved, and more broadly white and Black people, oppressors exposed their cruel, inhuman self. Colonization, sexual coercion, and enslavement of his own children contributed to the inhuman qualities of Thomas Jefferson. The socially constructed characteristics of race and gender condition one group to believe that they are superior to another group. As a result, both groups become inhuman. How is the history of the Hemings family remembered or forgotten? One tactic of white supremacy is to suppress culture and family history. In the Hemings family, this meant dispersing Sally Hemings' children after their 21st birthday. Two of the children, Beverly and Harriet, denied their family lineage in order to pass in society as free white people. The other two children, Madison and Eston, claimed their heritage and lived as free mixed-race people. Frantz Fanon describes a similar experience of racial suppression in his work, The Lived Experience of the Black Man. He writes, in all seriousness, they have been rinsing out their test tubes and adjusting their scales and have begun research on how the wretched Black man could whiten himself and thus rid himself of the burden of this bodily curse. Fanon argues that white people hold Black people to a white standard and will use any means necessary to dilute or erase Blackness. White people will use skin color as a marker to determine sexuality, intelligence, and trustworthiness. Oppressors place negative stereotypes on those who are deemed inferior. Therefore, when Thomas Jefferson sexually coerced and enslaved Sally Hemings, he diluted her Blackness and Black culture. The Hemings children were taught useful skills such as needlework, woodworking, and music in order to fit into white society. Thomas Jefferson may have justified this as civilizing the Hemings family, but in turn, it erased an important part of their culture. Fanon writes, "For not only must the Black man be Black, but he must be Black in relation to the white man." Some of the Hemings children, were able to live their lives as white people in order to avoid racism. The others had to live between the black and white worlds, always taking into account the white perspective to avoid prejudice. One descendant of Sally Hemings, Diana Redmond, talks about how there are no known images or descriptions of Sally Hemings.
And I would love to know what she looked like, but that's not meant to be. And I think that's a sadness, but that's a sadness for many descendants of enslaved families.
Stripping away the image of enslaved families deprives their ancestors of knowing their history. The question of the Hemingses' descendants: what does it mean to be connected to history? Decades after slavery ended, people were still left with the trauma that their ancestors were put through. Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings' descendants have come forward about their take on the Hemingses story. Author Annette Gordon-Reed writes that the affair of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings has been sensationalized by the public. She writes, Sally Hemings is often treated as a figure of no historical significance, a mere object of malicious personal gossip. That shouldn't surprise. Hemings neither spoke publicly about her life nor engaged in any public acts that have been recorded. Others, journalists, Jefferson's enemies, determined how she entered the spotlight, and they put her there with no real interest in her as a person. While popular media scandalized, and then practically erased, the story of Sally Hemings, the descendants have begun to reclaim and retell their history. One descendant, Shannon Looney, discusses the controversy that happened when the Hemings descendants were invited to the Thomas Jefferson family reunion for the first time.
He was bringing the slaves and the slave owners, children, and descendants together for the first time. So there were a lot of people that did not want that to happen. And it also could mean that their possible icon, that Jefferson was a rapist. And they didn't want that to be their ancestor. They didn't want that to be their hero.
Many people choose to close their eyes to the violent past of the United States because it would invalidate their place within American history. Jefferson's descendants cling so close to their American hero because it gives them a sense of belonging within a community. Emphasizing that their hero was a racist slave owner would invalidate the heroic, democratic aspects of Jefferson to this community. One descendant of Thomas and Martha Jefferson, Lucian Truscott, wanted to bring to light the enslaved community at Monticello. In an interview with CBS, he talks about how he experienced Monticello in his childhood versus how it is now.
I grew up at a time when you didn't hear the word slave here. You could go on 10 tours over 10 different years and never heard the word slave. And now the tours you take here are complete tours.
Collective remembrance of enslaved people is vital to Monticello. It is important to remember not only the heroic aspects, but also the sad, violent, and sinister parts of the lives of the Founding Fathers. Erasure of this memory upholds white supremacy. Forgetting that the United States was built from slave labor allows current U.S. politicians to forget the injustices that African Americans in the U.S. face to this day. To end this podcast, I will share a clip of Diana Redmond, a descendant of Sally Hemings. She talks about her connection to Monticello.
This is where my ancestors lived and labored. So that gave it made it feel different for me.
Can you describe the difference? What did you feel?
I won't say it was a sense of ownership, it was a sense of being.
A sense of being.
Yes. Being where my ancestors had been before me gave me that sense of, okay, we're part of this country, we're part of this growth, we're part of a bigger picture, and I can lay hands on things that they did.
Diana emphasizes that her ancestors, as well as all the ancestors of enslaved people, are part of the greater history of the United States. That concludes this episode. Thank you for listening.
Maybe she goes, maybe she